A racist cop attacked a black judge, thinking he could get away with it. But when the judge stood his ground and took action, the cop's arrogance turned to fear in the most satisfying way. This is the story that will leave you cheering for justice. Before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The flash of blue lights cuts through the darkness, reflecting off the rearview mirror of Judge Marcus Washington's BMW. His grip tightens on the steering wheel as he pulls over onto the pristine curb of Oakwood Estates, the affluent neighborhood where he purchased a home just 3 months ago. The same neighborhood where only 2% of residents look like him. The digital clock on his dashboard reads 11:38 p.m. Marcus takes a deep breath, the kind his father taught him decades ago. The kind that black men in America learn early and practice often. Through his side mirror, Marcus watches the officer approach. White male, mid-30s, hand already resting on his holster. No casual stroll, no benefit of the doubt. The weight of Marcus's judicial ID feels heavy in his breast pocket, right next to his heart that's now pounding, despite his composed exterior. License and registration, Officer Ryan Brenner demands, shining his tactical flashlight directly into Marcus's eyes, intentionally blinding him. No greeting, no explanation for the stop. "Good evening, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Marcus responds, his voice steady, the same voice that commands respect in his courtroom, the same voice that once defended the innocent as a public defender before he made history as the youngest black judge appointed to the circuit court. "You don't belong in this neighborhood," Brenner says, not even attempting to disguise the accusation in his tone. "We've had reports of suspicious activity." The dashboard camera records silently as the cold night air rushes through Marcus's open window. He can feel the history of this moment, not just his history, but the collective weight of every traffic stop where skin color was the only probable cause. In America, a black driver is 20% more likely to be stopped than a white driver, and 3 times more likely to be searched. "Officer, I live at 1487 Maple Lane, just 2 blocks from here. I'm Judge Marcus Washington of the 4th Circuit Court." The officer's expression hardens. "Sure you are. I'm going to need to see some ID, and I need you to step out of the vehicle now." As Brenner's hand tightens around his weapon, something unexpected happens. Judge Washington doesn't plead. He doesn't raise his voice. Instead, he calmly reaches for his phone. "Officer Brenner," Marcus says, reading the nameplate. "I'm activating my phone's recording app while I comply with your request. I'm also noting that it's 11:40 p.m. on March 8th, and you've provided no legal reason for this stop." For a split second, confusion replaces the aggression in Brenner's eyes. This isn't the reaction he expected. Not fear, not anger, but something far more dangerous to a man like him. Methodical documentation by someone who knows the system from both sides. Marcus Washington, son of civil rights activists, first in his family to attend college, and now a judge, knows exactly what's happening here. He's seen it from the defense table, from the prosecutor's side, and from the bench. And as he carefully places his hands where the officer can see them, he's already thinking 3 steps ahead in a game Brenner doesn't realize they're playing. Officer Brenner's face contorts with rage as Judge Washington continues recording. "I said get out of the car now!" he shouts, yanking the door open and reaching for his handcuffs. The power dynamic is shifting in real time, a police officer realizing his target isn't powerless and hating every second of it. As Marcus steps onto the pavement with deliberate movements, his mind races between contradicting imperatives. Maintain his dignity, protect his physical safety, uphold the system he's sworn to serve, and document every violation of that same system. "Officer, I'm complying fully," Marcus says, voice steady despite his racing heart. "But I want to be clear that I've given you no legal reason for this stop or to order me from my vehicle." Brenner's radio crackles. Dispatch, I need backup at Maple and Oakwood. Possible suspect, uncooperative, claiming to be some kind of judge. The emphasis on claiming stings sharper than Marcus expected. 15 years on the bench, over 3,000 cases presided over, and still, his very identity is suspicious. The same night across town, Police Chief Sandra Collins sits at her desk, reviewing incident reports. As one of only 3 black officers in the department, and its first female chief, Collins navigates a precarious balance every day. Her phone buzzes with a text from a patrol supervisor about Judge Washington's situation. The 3rd such incident in Oakwood Estates this month, all involving professional people of color, all conducted by the same officer. Collins closes her eyes momentarily. She fought for those dashboard cameras, fought for the body cams that Officer Brenner conveniently reported as malfunctioning tonight. She knows what's happening, but proving it requires evidence that keeps disappearing. The next morning, District Attorney Michael Flynn sighs heavily as Marcus sits across from him in his office. They've known each other for 20 years, first as opposing counsel, then as colleagues. Marcus, you know I take these matters seriously, Flynn says, not quite meeting his eyes. But Brenner has a clean record, no formal complaints. Because they get buried, Michael, Marcus responds. You know how this works. Check how many stops he's made in Oakwood since the demographics started changing. Check who gets stopped. Flynn shuffles papers uncomfortably. The department's internal affairs won't do anything without pressure, Marcus interrupts. Michael, if this happened to me, a judge, what happens to the delivery driver, the nurse coming home from night shift, the college student? Outside the DA's office, community activist Elena Rodriguez waits with a small group of protesters. When Marcus emerges, she approaches with the intensity of someone who's fought this battle too many times. Judge Washington, we've documented 17 similar incidents in the past year, she says, handing him a carefully organized folder. No one would listen, but maybe they'll listen to you. That evening, Marcus sits with his 16-year-old son, Jamal, who watches his father with new eyes, not just as dad, but as a black man navigating a system designed to break him. Dad, the video from your phone is getting shared everywhere, Jamal says, showing him the social media posts. But the news is saying you're exaggerating. They're saying you're playing the race card. Marcus feels the familiar twist in his gut, the double burden of fighting injustice while simultaneously defending his right to fight it. What matters is the truth, Jamal. His phone rings, an anonymous caller. You should drop this if you care about your family, a voice warns before hanging up. The 3rd such call today. The weeks that follow reveal a pattern of bureaucratic stonewalling. The official complaint Marcus files gets misplaced, twice. The dashboard camera footage is suddenly corrupted. 3 witnesses who saw the stop are reluctant to come forward, one directly stating, I can't afford trouble with the police in my neighborhood. But Judge Washington methodically builds his case. Through Elena's network, he connects with 5 other professionals of color who experienced identical stops in Oakwood. None filed formal complaints. Fear, exhaustion, and the certainty nothing would change. Then the breakthrough. A young officer, troubled by department culture, anonymously forwards text messages from Brenner to other officers. Keeping Oakwood safe from the new element moving in. Another one tonight. These people don't belong here no matter what jobs they claim to have. As Marcus reviews the messages, his hands shake with a complex emotion. Not just anger, but vindication mingled with sorrow. This isn't about one traffic stop anymore. It's about an entire system that requires extraordinary evidence to prove what Black Americans experience as ordinary reality. Chief Collins calls him directly that evening. Judge Washington, we need to talk. There's more to this than even I realized. The Police Conduct Review Board hearing room buzzes with tension. Local news cameras crowd the back wall, Officer Brenner sits with his union representative and department lawyer, his face a mask of righteous indignation. On the opposite side, Judge Marcus Washington straightens his tie. Not the judicial robes that normally grant him authority, but a simple suit that feels like armor in this battlefield. This moment was never inevitable. Most complaints against officers die in administrative purgatory. Most victims give up. Most systems protect their own. But Marcus Washington isn't most people, and this isn't most cases. Judge Washington, please describe the events of March 8th, says the review board chairperson, her voice amplified through the microphone. Marcus approaches the podium, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. The stakes transcend his individual experience, something he's come to understand with painful clarity over the past weeks. I could tell you about being pulled over without cause, Marcus begins, his voice steady. I could detail how Officer Brenner refused to believe I was a judge, how he ordered me from my vehicle with his hand on his weapon, how he called for backup because a black man in an affluent neighborhood was inherently suspicious. The room hangs on his words. This is the story they expected, important but familiar. But this isn't about one traffic stop, Marcus continues, his tone shifting. This is about what happens when those sworn to protect and serve instead profile and intimidate. This is about how Officer Brenner has conducted identical stops of 17 black and brown professionals in Oakwood estates in the past year alone. Murmurs ripple through the audience. Brenner's attorney stands to object, but Marcus continues, unshakable. I have here sworn statements from Dr. Elaine Patterson, stopped 3 times in 2 months, from Professor James Chen, handcuffed on his own front lawn, from surgical nurse Teresa Diaz, made to sit on the curb in her scrubs. Marcus places a thick binder on the evidence table. None filed formal complaints because none believed anything would change. None had the privilege of my position or legal knowledge. Officer Brenner shifts uncomfortably as Marcus reveals what no one expected him to know. Officer Brenner's body camera was functioning that night, despite department records claiming otherwise. The footage was automatically uploaded to the cloud server before it could be deleted locally. The room erupts. This revelation isn't just damning, it suggests a cover-up beyond one officer. From the back of the room, Police Chief Sandra Collins stands, her expression unreadable. For weeks, rumors circulated that she was protecting Brenner. For weeks, community activists questioned her loyalty. For weeks, she said nothing. The board should know, Collins announces, silencing the room instantly, that Internal Affairs has been investigating a pattern of misconduct involving Officer Brenner and 3 other officers for the past 7 months. We needed irrefutable evidence that would stand up to union challenges and legal scrutiny, Collins continues. Judge Washington's meticulous documentation provided the final pieces we needed. Marcus looks at Collins with new understanding. She wasn't ignoring the problem. She was building a case that couldn't be dismissed, working within a system designed to protect its own. The hearing takes an unexpected turn as Elena Rodriguez escorts an elderly black man to the podium. William Harris, 73, a retired postal worker. Officer Brenner stopped me last year, Harris testifies, his voice trembling slightly. When I showed him I lived in Oakwood, he said people like me don't belong there. I tried to report it. No one would take my statement. I've lived in this city for 50 years, delivered mail to half the people in this room, and I was made to feel like a criminal in my own neighborhood. Tears streamed down Harris's weathered face. Judge Washington called me last week. First person who ever asked for my story. First person who ever believed it mattered. The emotional testimony continues as victim after victim steps forward, not just from Oakwood, but from across the city. People who didn't have Marcus's connections or credentials. People whose complaints vanished into administrative black holes. People who stopped believing in justice but showed up anyway. Marcus watches from his seat, transformed by the realization that his position grants him not just privilege, but responsibility. This isn't about vindication for one humiliating night. It's about using his access to power to force accountability that should exist without his intervention. When he returns to the podium for closing statements, Marcus speaks not as a victim seeking justice, but as a catalyst for systemic change. This board has the power to address not just one officer's actions, but the culture that protected him, Marcus says. I don't just want Officer Brenner disciplined. I want mandatory review of all traffic stop patterns. I want civilian oversight with actual authority. I want body camera footage independently secured. His voice rises with conviction, not anger. What happened to me was not exceptional. It was simply better documented. True justice isn't making an example of one officer. True justice is transforming the system that allowed him to operate unchecked for years. That's what I'm asking for today. The power in the room has shifted, not through shouting or threats, but through meticulous evidence, strategic alliance building, and the moral authority of collective testimony. As Marcus concludes his statement, even Brenner's supporters seem deflated, aware they're witnessing not just a personal victory, but the beginning of structural change they can no longer prevent. 3 weeks after the hearing, the Police Conduct Review Board delivers its decision. The press release tersely announces that Officer Brenner has been suspended for 60 days without pay and will undergo mandatory bias training and community service. He will not be fired. He will return to duty, though not in Oakwood Estates. It's not the punishment many hoped for, but it's more than most expected. The real victory lies in the accompanying departmental reforms. A new civilian oversight committee with actual subpoena power, mandatory review of all officers' stop patterns on a quarterly basis, and body camera footage now automatically uploaded to servers outside police control. Marcus sits in his home office reading the press release, his emotions complicated. The system bent toward justice. It didn't break entirely, but it bent. In America, that counts as progress. His phone lights up with a text from Elena Rodriguez. Not enough, but more than we've ever gotten. Thank you. Chief Collins calls him personally. I wanted you to hear this from me, she says, her voice carrying the weariness of someone fighting battles on multiple fronts. Some officers are circulating a petition questioning your impartiality in cases involving police testimony. Marcus nods to himself, unsurprised. And the DA's office? Flynn is supportive publicly, but he's worried about relationships with the department. There's talk of requesting you recuse yourself from certain cases. The cost of standing up becomes clearer every day. In his 15 years on the bench, Marcus has developed working relationships with countless officers, relationships now strained by suspicion or outright hostility. Some colleagues avoid his gaze in courthouse hallways. Others express passionate support, but only in private. Yet there are unexpected allies too. 3 judges from neighboring counties reached out to implement similar accountability measures. The State Judicial Ethics Committee invited Marcus to help draft new guidelines for addressing systemic bias. 6 months later, Marcus stands before a classroom of black law students at his alma mater. These young faces represent everything he fought for, the chance to exist in professional spaces without constantly defending their right to be there. The system was never designed for people who look like us, Marcus tells them, but we cannot abandon it because too many lives depend on its functioning justly. Our presence is itself an act of transformation. The mentorship program he established pairs these students with judges and senior attorneys who understand the unique challenges they face. Not just academic guidance, but strategies for navigating spaces that still question their legitimacy daily. Across town that same afternoon, something unprecedented occurs. Chief Collins hosts a community forum in Oakwood Estates with residents and officers sitting side by side, uncomfortable, skeptical, but present. It's hardly utopian harmony, but it's conversation where once there was only suspicion. On a Saturday morning, Marcus takes Jamal shopping for new basketball shoes. As they browse the athletic store, a security guard follows them at a discreet but unmistakable distance. Some things haven't changed, may never change completely. Later that evening, father and son have a conversation that echoes through generations of black families. The careful instructions on how to survive police encounters, hands visible, movements slow, tone respectful regardless of provocation. The burden of compliance required to simply stay alive. "It's not fair that we have to have this talk," Jamal says, anger and resignation battling in his young voice. "No, it's not," Marcus agrees. "But something important has changed. Now there's a record when things go wrong. Now there's a pathway to accountability that didn't exist before. Not perfect, not complete, but real." The next morning, Judge Marcus Washington puts on his judicial robes and returns to his courtroom. The same judge, but not the same man. His experience transformed him from someone who believed in the system's capacity for justice to someone committed to forcing that capacity into reality, case by case, reform by reform. The scales of justice don't balance themselves. They never have. They require the constant pressure of those who recognize imbalance and refuse to accept it. Marcus Washington became one more hand applying that pressure, not alone, but part of a generations-long effort to bend the arc of history toward justice. When those sworn to uphold justice become its greatest threat, does true change come from dismantling systems or transforming them from within? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps the question itself is too simple for such a complex struggle. What would you do if you stood in Judge Washington's shoes? And more importantly, what will you do in your own?